So this is going to be the second of our talks as part of the Marine Festival, which we're holding on a Friday evening. And I'm delighted to welcome Claire Wallerstein along this evening. She will explain what she's going to talk about a little later, but primarily it's going to be a film that she will show, which she has made. And we propose that we start off the evening with myself just chatting to Claire, asking her a bit about her career and what she's been up to. And then we'll show the film, and then after that we'll have more a question and answer session, if you like, or perhaps it might turn into more of a discussion. So there's quite a small group of us. So I think we'll begin with that. So I'll come on. Claire. So welcome to London, Claire. Have you been here before?
No, I haven't. It was always one of those places that I thought I'd absolutely love to go to, but it was just difficult, you know, and then you hear about how hard it is to get accommodation, and so I never imagined I'd come, so I just feel really, really grateful that I've had this opportunity and I'm making the most of it, even having had a horrible toe injury this morning by kicking a granite boulder. I still managed to walk right up to the very northern tip today, and you know, just amazed by the landscape and the coast and the birds and the horses and everything else. And it's just beautiful. You feel like you're in Scotland almost, rather than in the Bristol Channel. I love it.
Great. And how had you known about London? Was there a particular aspect of the island that you were aware of?
I think I must have known about it for quite a while. I must have known a couple of people who'd been here. And somehow or another I knew about it being a marine protected area, very special for that. And obviously I knew about puffins. I already knew that Lundy meant puffin because I was really lucky a few years ago. I got to go on a tour ship around Svalbard in the Norwegian Arctic. And I was actually on a plastic sampling trip looking at plastic that washes up, that comes all the way up the Gulf Stream. You know, they are, I can't remember, they're only 600 miles south of the North Pole, you know, in the middle of absolutely nowhere, when there's an ocean and no nothing, and yet the amount of plastic that comes up from everywhere, really, and extraordinary stuff that couldn't have been locally generated. So it was a pretty horrifying trip on that level, but very interesting as well. And on the boat we were on, they had a big laminated, illustrated thing called the seabirds around, because obviously it's just amazing now in the sun, you know, 24-hour daylight. The birds are on the go the whole time, everything's on the go the whole time. And one of them was puffin, and it was Lundy. And then that was my light bulb moment in Norwegian. Yes, and then in the film that you're about to see, we do have a pleasingly quick reference to Lundy, because there is a whole section where you're talking about highly protected marine areas.
Now, a little bit about yourself, if I can. I gather your career started off as a journalist, is that right? And then developed in other ways. So could you just briefly perhaps explain what brought you to being perhaps what you are now, which is more of an environmental campaign, I think so.
Yeah, although you're probably using a lot of those journalistic skills, I guess. So, well, I don't know how far back you want me to go, but I started out, I actually did a degree in German politics, which has got nothing to do with anything. And then I did a postgraduate diploma in journalism. I ended up working in local papers, and then in London, I was just telling Robert before, sort of at the height of the phone tapping scandal, which was a strange time to be working in journalism. And you know, there was a lot of dark stuff going on in journalism in London then. So to escape that, my boyfriend at the time and myself, who was also a journalist, we ended up going to the Philippines. We lived there for 3.5 years. And then Venezuela, screening for national papers in the UK and other places in the world. Then I came back to England. My father was very sick, so I had to come back, and I ended up working as a press officer at the International Fund for Animal Welfare in London. Met my husband, he's Spanish, so we went to live in Spain, thinking that salary we could all survive, and I wouldn't really have to do too much and just look after these little babies that we now had. But of course, pretty much as soon as we got there was the huge financial crash, and we bought a house with a mortgage sort of like pretty much the day before. So he lost his job. I ended up having to start translating, so I became a Spanish translator then for a long time, and eventually came back to Cornwall, to my home village, when my mother was poorly. And I guess why I've ended up doing what I'm doing now sort of stems back to that. I mean, I'd always been very, very much interested in environmental topics, and that was a lot of what I've come from my journalism. Probably actually started with my mum. She used to take me when I was tiny on anti-vivisection marches and all sorts of things. But coming back to Cornwall after such a long time away and taking my now small children down to the beach, it was just one day that was like the light bulb moment for me, which was going down to our local beach, Treganthel, which is past Whitsand Bay, don't know if you know it. Beautiful, long, sandy stretch. And getting down to the beach and just, I couldn't believe it. It was like a whole beach was covered in confetti. But it wasn't confetti, it was microplastics. So this is a kind of, the sea salts debris, so you end up with different kinds of things depending on the sort of grade of the substrate you've got. So on these fine sandy beaches you tend to get a lot of the fine floating microplastics washing out. And it was just this tide line, kilometre or more long and a couple of metres wide of nurdles, which are the little plastic pellets that's all of our plastic stuff made from, and just smashed up bits of unrecognisable plastic. I've got a photo of my kids just sort of squatting on all of this, and it was like the scales fell away from my eyes. And I remember coming down to that beach when I was a child and playing with sticks and feathers and shells, and then they were just surrounded by all of this. It was just like the sea had vomited down onto the beach, and I just thought, someone's got to be doing something about this. And you start Googling, and then you realise there's nobody doing anything about it. And so then with a couple of friends, we decided, well, we've got to do something. So started up the beach cleaning group, called Arrangements for Beach Care, which, we did lots and lots of stuff, and we thought, well, people will lose interest because, there's only a certain momentum that these things have. But in fact, it grew and it grew and it grew, and I ran that group for 8 years. We did monthly beach cleans. A friend of mine who used to be an agricultural engineer actually developed a machine that could sift the microplastics out of the sand. And we used to go down with this machine, we'd get over 100 people sometimes. Still very labour intensive because you'd have to get down on your hands and knees with a dustpan and brush to sweep this stuff up to go through the machine. And we millions and millions and millions of these pellets and pieces from the beach, which was incredible. We did a lot of campaigns, just a few things. One of them was one winter, we, just with a few other local beach cleaning groups, we decided to try and collect all the bottle tops that had washed up. I wanted to focus on bottle tops because it's something that everyone can relate to because we all use these plastic bottles every day. And this went on for 3 or 4 months, and then we strung together all the bottle tops that we collected, and that string stretched 1.1 kilometres. It was about 65,000 bottle tops. We had this crazy day when we launched it, and we had about 400 people carrying this chain down to the beach. And that, that was such an amazing tool. That was used, it was taken to the European Parliament, Charles and Camilla saw it when they came to Cornwall, went to the Royal Geographical Society. So it's, those sorts of things have been really brilliant in trying to make people who don't go down and see what's actually happening on the beach understand what impact their actions can have. And we did all sorts of things. One of them, we discovered after a while that actually more than half of the little pellets that we were picking up weren't nurdles at all. They looked a little bit different. They were anomaly enriched, and finally discovered that actually this is what South West Water uses to filter our sewage. So they are the base for a biofilm bacteria that's used. The wastewater sort of falls through it, got a big surface area, and it produces, it's amazing in terms biological and chemical quality of the effluent, but obviously they're 3 millimetres wide, you know. No joined up thinking in that design at all, and this is the last stage in the process before that water goes back out to the sea or the river, and they just have numerous spills. There was one big spill down at Truro in 2010, these things where there was billions, and just months later they were covering the whole of the coasts of northern France and Holland. You know, it's been a huge, huge problem. So did all sorts of things like that, and you know, it did become my absolute obsession and passion. Really for me, mainly just because of the impact on wildlife. You know, I mean, we've all had those statistics from the UN. You know, it's at least 1 million seabirds and 100,000 marine mammals that are killed by plastic in the sea every year. You know, and it's coming from us. You know, and it just seems like something that should be so easy to stop and control. But over that time, I was also going to lots of conferences and meeting marine scientists from Exeter University and other places who I've become quite friendly with, and I just sort of started to get a sense of this growing frustration. People would say to me, you know, we thought that marine plastic was going to be this springboard topic that, you know, would obviously people care about it, but it would help people to become more concerned about the ocean and understand more about the threats they're facing. You know, like climate change being probably the big one. But it's like we've all just got stuck on plastic. We all over the media. It's not controversial. You know, there's no politics around it. You can see the impact. It's right here, and you can actually go down to the beach and do something about it. But actually, terrible as it is, it's only a tiny part of the problems that are affecting the sea. And so I thought actually maybe we really need to reframe the whole sort of discourse around marine plastic and look at it more as a small part of the climate crisis, which it is in terms of what it's made from and the emissions it produces, rather than looking at it as this be-all and end-all in itself, because you can take all the plastic out of the sea and you can still have the problems being caused by climate change. So I've been working for a while through the beach community with an environmental filmmaker from Brian Stokes, and we are very much on the same page with all this stuff, so we thought it would be great to make a film actually looking at how climate change is affecting our marine environment in Cornwall. Because so often when it's presented in the media, we're looking at things that are happening, you know, in the Pacific Islands or Australia or, you know, coral reefs. Nobody really knows about what's happening here. And I think if people don't see it as a problem or an issue where they live, you know, it's very hard to make it feel like it's something that's really impacting you or that you need to do much about. So we made this film, and didn't really stop there, because then we thought, no, we've got to make more. Because, you know, this is an important film, but probably a lot of the audience are going to be really people who already care and are engaged. Actually, you know, we need to reach those unengaged audiences and try and cover all the topics around climate change and how it's affecting us here in Cornwall. So it's a series of 12. We've only made 4 so far, and the first 3 are all marine related, so you might like to have a look. The second one is looking at how climate change is affecting Cornwall's fishing industry, because we very much wanted to be focusing on people who might not normally be perceived as engaging with environmental films or messaging. So each of our films is presented by a different person who's relevant to or passionate about that topic. So this one is actually presented by a local fisherman, and he's absolutely brilliant, you know, and we're sort of letting people tell their stories. Fishermen, they're the first people who, you know, we might be in our homes or offices worrying about climate change, but they are like the canaries in the coal mines. They are seeing what's happening. They're pulling themselves out of the sea every day. They can see those changes. And so we're really trying to, it's quite walking on eggshells sort of acts a lot of the time, but what we're really trying to do is not be pinpointing or preaching or judging, just letting people tell their stories and do it in quite a gentle way. Sea. That fishing one's been by far the most popular and successful. It's been picked up by fishing industry conferences and festivals in France. I think it translates into French. It's, yeah. So, working on the food and farming one now, which is good.
Well, I think we've wasted our appetite. I'm trying to get to see the film. So, would you like to just tell us the title of this one?
Yes, yes. This one is called Under the Surface.
This is what defines Cornwall. We rely on the sea for tourism and sport, for fishing, transport and fun. But beneath that glittering surface, some big changes are starting to happen. I'm Wallerstein, and this is my climate story. I've spent the past 8 years running beach cleans near my home in southeast Cornwall and campaigning to tackle plastic pollution. Volunteer groups like ours all around Cornwall have worked hard for years and removed hundreds of tons of plastic from our shores. It feels like the message has really been getting through. Most people don't have to think twice about what is the biggest threat to life in the sea.
Loads of people just throw away stuff.
Plastic. Plastic. It has to be the amount of plastics that's being discharged.
First thing comes to mind is plastic.
But marine experts aren't so sure.
The focus on marine plastics in the last 10 years has been really important, but actually I worry we're now at a point that it's perhaps distracting to some of the other large environmental challenges we face, such as climate change.
Climate change is happening. I know there are disbelievers, but it is happening. And unless we do something very rapidly, we are going to see really serious consequences in the next 10 to 20 years.
The thing to be most worried about is temperature change in the ocean at the rate that we're seeing it. Definitely.
Climate change in the marine environment usually conjures up images of things far away from home, like polar bears, melting ice caps and bleached coral reefs. But I wanted to find out if it's such a big problem in Cornwall, so I met up with scientist Matthew Witt, whose job involves satellite tagging some of the incredible marine species that visit Cornwall, including leatherback turtles, bluefin tuna and basking sharks.
In the old records, this would be like a relatively good density hotspot for basking sharks, but not anymore. A basking shark is a plankton-eating shark. There's only a few plankton-eating sharks. The other one is the megamouth and the really well-known whale shark. They can grow up to 10 metres long. They produce few young in every few years, and the period over which that young shark develops inside the female is probably up to something like 2 years. Since 2012, we've tagged 90 sharks, and they've made some fantastic movements from Scotland all the way down to Morocco and to the Madeira and the Canary Islands.
But in more recent years, the numbers reported off our coast have plummeted. Public sightings of basking sharks reported to the Cornwall Wildlife Trust fell from over 200 in 2006 to just 6 in 2019.
Understanding how the population might be changing is actually really quite challenging, because unlike dolphins and porpoises, they're not obliged to come to the surface to breathe, so counting them is really very hard.
There are still many unknowns about what's driving the sharks' decline, but one likely reason is changes to their food source.
Basking sharks are a bit like blue whales. They're some of the largest animals in the world, and they sustain themselves on some of the smallest. So when plankton changes, we think so do the behaviours of basking sharks.
The sharks' food source is changing, and plankton analyst Marianne Wooten is worried.
When we look at the beautiful environment that we've got here, the sea, most people don't stop to think about all the billions of organisms that are in the sea. They might think about fish, mammals, seals, dolphins, whatnot, but who really actually holds up a jar of seawater and thinks, oh yeah, there's plankton in there? It's kind of not on our radar, really. There's thousands of organisms that form plankton. We can separate them into two distinct groups. We've got the phytoplankton, the plant plankton, and just like plants on Earth, they're important because they release oxygen into the atmosphere. So up to about 50% of the net oxygen that's around us now is produced by the phytoplankton, the plant plankton. So that means that every other breath is a plankton breath. And then we have these animal plankton. They're also important because, of course, these guys form the food for other animals higher up in the trophic chain. So we've got small fish feeding on them, some seabirds feed directly on plankton, and then we have these amazing baleen whales, of course, that they feed directly on plankton too. But you don't have to feed directly on plankton for plankton to be important to you in the sea. Most animals, their life is dependent on plankton at some point in their life history. Plankton are an amazingly important part of the food web. Without plankton, the oceans would be barren. We'd have less oxygen in the atmosphere. But crucially, all of these thousands, billions of plankton that are in the ocean, what happens to them when they die? Well, they rain down, they settle down, and they become part of the sediment, and they lock away carbon.
Marianne works for the Continuous Plankton Recorder, which has been running for nearly 90 years. It's the longest running and most geographically extensive survey of its kind anywhere in the world. So far, it's sampled more than 7 million miles of ocean, and it's been detecting some disturbing shifts in plankton populations.
The warmer species are moving gradually further north, and the colder water species are retreating further and further north. And that distance is about 10 degrees latitude in the last 50 years. And that's in response, direct response to sea surface temperatures induced by climate change.
Not so long ago, the Cornish coast was the stronghold for a species of cold water plankton that was an incredibly important part of the marine food chain. But now, a different species is moving in, spelling major changes for the fish we eat and all other life in our seas.
There's two copepods in particular that we find around the coast here that are really quite important for fish in particular, larval fish, and all sorts of other organisms. The cold water copepods now disappeared. This warmer water one has moved in there. You might think, okay, well, one's moved out, another one's moved in. Everything's all right still, isn't it? It's always more complex than that. Although a warmer water one's moved in, its seasonal peak is a different place in time, and it's nowhere near as abundant, nowhere near. So that means now larval fish that come along, that have always come along for hundreds of years and expect there to be food around, well, now there's just not as much food around.
This mismatch between the times when plankton is around and when the animals actually need to eat it is already having dramatic effects, as ornithologist Mark Grantham explained to me.
These cliff areas are a bit of a scarcity these days. If you go back even just 20, 25 years, we would have had a dozen kittiwake nesting sites like this dotted around Cornwall. Since then, we're now down to 5. Kittiwake is Britain's commonest gull, but we don't think it is because they're either nesting on inaccessible cliffs or in the winter they're spending their time out at sea. They're the most pelagic of gulls, they're the most seafaring of gulls, and really that's what drives their decline from a climate change point of view, is that the sea, especially in the southern edge of the range, is just gradually warming, and you're talking half a degree a decade. If you look at the much bigger scale, kittiwake's now extinct in Spain. Kittiwake is now extinct in the Channel Islands. It's extinct in southern France. If you look along the south coast of Britain, so between Kent and the Scillies, we've lost 60% of our colonies in the last 20 years. So it's not sustainable. To be a successful kittiwake colony, you need to be producing between 1.2, 1.5 chicks per pair. Here, we don't make one.
Kittiwakes feed on small larval fish and sand eels, which in turn feed on plankton. But as our waters warm, this food source is being disrupted.
Basically, the food that these birds need just isn't there. So they become food stressed, and when you're food stressed, you're less likely to breed. If kittiwakes are doing badly, then it's a real indicator that everything else in the food chain below it is doing badly. Seabirds are the easiest indicator to look at as to the state of the ocean. They are very long-lived birds, so it is hard to keep track of how big the decline might be. I mean, we can count the birds, we can count colonies, we can count the number of birds in those colonies, but what we don't know is when those numbers go down, are those birds moving elsewhere? Are they dying, or are they just being pushed further north? Eventually you just run out of places to go. There's only so far north you can go before you run out of places to nest.
It's shocking to learn just how much our seas are already changing, and without most of us even having noticed. But the sea could be our biggest ally in helping to cushion the impact of climate change. And with almost 400 miles of coastline, Cornwall could pave the way in protecting the marine ecosystems that we'll need to protect us in future.
Nature has got an incredible power to heal itself if we let it have the space to do that. And the sea is an ideal example of that. We don't need to actively manage the sea for those habitats to come back and restore and become wildlife rich again. We need to start looking at the sea as both a solution for the current ecological crisis, but also the climate crisis.
It's hoped Cornwall could soon pilot an ambitious national scheme called Highly Protected Marine Areas, where all damaging human activity in fishing would be banned. Fishermen may not like this idea, but their concerns could turn out to be unfounded if what has happened around the tiny Devon island of Lundy is anything to go by.
Lundy's the only real total marine nature reserve that we've got at the moment. The impacts and the recovery of the wildlife, and particularly scallops and lobsters in that marine reserve, boomed. So the numbers within the reserve have got bigger, the actual animals themselves have got bigger, and as a consequence they're spilling over into the wider area around Lundy and improving the local fisheries. So while there's initial impact in the fisheries are excluded from that small area, over the course of the long term, and we're talking sort of 5 to 10 years, they're seeing the benefits now.
The aim of the HPMAs would be to let large areas around UK coasts recover as whole and healthy ecosystems. Some of these underwater habitats can store much more carbon than trees on land, so they'll play a really important role in helping us to limit global heating.
Our merle beds, which is calcified seaweed, really important carbon habitat. Our kelp beds and seaweeds are really valuable in storing carbon. And then further offshore, we have huge areas of deep sea sediment and muds. And whilst they don't look very much, deep sea mud can store 5 times more carbon than upland peat. We've got really valuable tidal ecosystems with areas of salt marsh that are incredibly carbon rich. That habitat can store this carbon for long periods of time. We've got a history of draining those habitats over the recent centuries. And what we now need to do is get rid of that mindset. We allow the sea to come back into those areas and the salt marsh to flourish and thrive again. We're not only building our biodiversity in those areas, but also storing much more carbon. In Cornwall, we have got a massive resource and we really want to get this moving quickly. We're at the process of shortlisting potential inshore sites, which would be really valuable for communities, but also offshore sites, where just taking away some of the fishing activity could have massive positive consequences for climate action and carbon sequestration.
Ruth hopes the first trial highly protected marine areas could get off the ground within the next year. But elsewhere in Cornwall, people are looking at other ways of harnessing the carbon storage potential of our underwater forests.
They contain more minerals, more vitamins than any other food group. They have antiviral, antibacterial, anti-carcinogenic properties even. They can be used for antibiotics. They're just incredible. You can make everything out of it that is now produced by oil. It can solve the world's problems.
The Cornish Seaweed Company harvests some of the 650 species of seaweed from around the Lizard. Sales are doubling every year, so now Tim's company has embarked on England's first ever project to farm sugar kelp.
We started the project 3 years ago with basically zero knowledge of any farming, and farming seaweed in Europe is a very new thing still. So we didn't know what to expect. In the first year we tried, we did everything wrong that we could have done wrong. So we didn't grow a single seaweed, which was almost encouraging really, because you want to make those mistakes when you start up and when everything is still small.
After these teething problems, the company is now growing several tons of sugar kelp on ropes at a floating mussel farm. Right now, it's all about food, but because kelp grows so fast, there could be an interesting side benefit in helping to suck up carbon.
There's definitely a lot more potential to store carbon in the sea compared to the land. To start with, trees take years to grow and actually start absorbing carbon, not until like 20 years or something, and that's too late. Whilst if you do seaweed, in 6 months it grows 2 meters long. Immediately you can start absorbing carbon. And there's just so much more space. One of the things that you can do is taking the sugar kelp and burying it in the deep sea where it will stay there for a long time, meaning that you kind of bury the carbon. It's not something that we're working on at the moment, but it's something we're definitely looking into.
Seaweed could help us to fight climate change in an even more surprising way too. We have over 300,000 cows in Cornwall, and each time they burp they release methane, a greenhouse gas that's tens of times more potent than carbon dioxide.
One of the ways seaweeds can be beneficial to the climate is to add about 2% dried seaweed, specific seaweeds called Asparagopsis taxiformis, to cattle feed, which then reduces cows from burping. So if we can grow that species, we can already help fight climate change. There is incredible potential to expand seaweed farms in Cornwall and further up in the UK as well. One of the problems that Cornwall has is a lot of storms coming from east, west, north or south. Seaweed farms can reduce wave height and thereby coastal erosion. So if there's areas in the UK or in the world that are prone to coastal erosion, it kind of makes sense to use seaweed farms to put in front of them to dampen that impact of the sea.
Increased storminess as our climate changes is a problem for many marine animals too. Sue Sayer has dedicated the past 20 years of her life to studying Cornwall's grey seals, and she took me out onto the cliffs near where she lives to explain more.
Seals in Cornwall are very special because they are at the southernmost range of their species range. In the UK, we've got 34% of the world's population, but even so, there are more red squirrels in the UK than there are grey seals. So this is not a massively numerate population. 2017 was the start of a potential series of years that have been very difficult and challenging for seals during the pupping season. Storm Brian was a storm that occurred in October, start of the pupping season, on a big spring tide of the year at high tide. And these massive swells probably washed off every seal pup that was alive on the Scillies at the time, washed them off all their beaches away from their mothers. The following year there was a really interesting impact. We think what happened is lots of mums lost their pups. They had complications like mastitis because they weren't able to get rid of their milk and feed their pups. And they then had hormonal issues, so they didn't mate when they should have mated. So the following year we had something like a 43 to 46% drop in pup numbers, potentially because of the complications of the storms the previous year. It's like if you lose your child and you've got milk, let alone all the emotional stuff, you know, it must be hideous, mustn't it? And I've watched mums come out for 15 days consecutively to try and feed a dead pup that's still on the beach. Their mothering instinct is so strong that if they can smell the pup, they will try and feed it even if it's being scavenged by gulls.
Sue estimates a couple of hundred seals are born around the Cornish coast each year, but recently the number of pups needing to be rescued has risen fast, as well as pups and adults washing up dead. Many of these casualties could be due to stormier seas.
Clearly seals are very competent in the water, massively agile and fantastically wonderful to look at. In a big storm swell, that is a real challenge. It's the biggest challenge for the youngest, smallest, weakest seals, but it's also a challenge for adults. In the last season, particularly after the storms, there were a lot of trauma injuries. Bashed heads, hemorrhages on the brain, broken jaws, cracked ribs, that kind of thing, when animals just lose control and crash against a rock in a big wave.
Climate change is also bringing heavier rain, which you might not think would bother a waterproof species.
The rain has been coming in extreme events and it saturates the rock and then the rock slides and it slides over a haul-out beach and seals get killed underneath the rockfall. We've had that happen on numerous occasions, but much worse than that is when it happens on a pupping cave in the pupping season. One of my favourite seals, I saw her just outside the cave just before the rockfall happened. I went the following week and I just couldn't believe the transformation in the cliff because it looked like a different place. I haven't seen her since, so I'm guessing that she and her pup and numerous other mums and pups would have been in those sea caves and perished.
Seals in Cornwall usually give birth between August and December, but Sue thinks that might change. As our winters become stormier, pups born earlier could become more successful. This might solve one problem, but could cause another. especially as Cornwall's tourist industry grows.
Most seal pups tend to be born in remoter places. Often on the north coast here, it's on beaches that are inaccessible, which is fine. However, a pup will leave the beach at 3 weeks, and those are the animals that tend to come into conflict with humans because they'll rock up on a public beach because they're exhausted and just want to sleep. It's a public beach and people just want to have a look. If you shift the cycles of the natural world, that interaction and conflict between us and nature is going to get worse.
But whether you love it or loathe it, tourism is a major part of Cornwall's economy, and perhaps nowhere more so than the Isles of Scilly.
The main reason that people give for coming to our islands is the stunning landscape, the peacefulness, but also our wildlife. If we haven't got the wildlife returning to our islands, then people aren't going to come here to be able to see it.
But increasingly stormy weather is affecting the seabirds that so many visitors flock here to watch, not just while they're feeding out at sea, but also when they come ashore to breed. The problem is a tree from New Zealand that was brought to the Scillies over 100 years ago.
Pittosporum was brought to the islands primarily by farmers who fence or hedgerow fields to protect the flowers in the flower fields because of the wind that we have around the islands. One of the downsides to the tree is that it has these little pom-poms on. The birds really love the seeds within the pom-poms. So our land birds will eat the seeds, they then disperse all over the islands. We've now got trees on all of our uninhabited islands. Now, when you think about gulls, puffins, Manx shearwater, they like wide open spaces where they can see predators, where they feel that they can protect their chicks the best. They like rocky outcrops that they can stand on and they can kind of survey the land beneath them. When you've got Pittosporum trees that are popping up everywhere, it blocks the view. It also removes areas of breeding ground. So the ranger team will go out to our uninhabited islands and they will remove Pittosporum trees. It's a huge task because they're really fast growing. They self-seed too, so once you've got a tree on an island, it just kind of pops seeds everywhere. Their main tasks in the winter is going to our uninhabited islands and trying to keep them how they used to be, so wide open spaces that the birds like. With the severity and frequency of the winter storms, the ranger team can't get to the uninhabited islands as much as they used to be able to, because when they go there, they go on a dinghy with brush cutters, chainsaws, all of the equipment they need, and it's beach landings or rock landings for most of the time. And obviously, if we've got big ground seas, big swells, they can't land on the islands.
Sadly, storms can also damage some of the very marine habitats that we really need to help suck up carbon. I went out kayaking with Fiona Crouch to find out more about her work to protect one of them.
Seagrass is amazing. It's known as a wonder plant. Not many people know about it because it's below the waves. It photosynthesises, just like our trees and our plants on land. And so it pulls in carbon dioxide and then it releases oxygen. It can store carbon like 35 times more than our rainforest. And it can consolidate sediment, so it can be good to reduce coastal erosion because it reduces the impact of waves on our shores. It's an amazing nursery ground for lots of different species, like commercial species of fish, which is really important, and other species such as seahorses and stalk jellyfish. So it's a brilliant, brilliant plant.
But the UK has lost over 90% of its seagrass meadows in the past century. Fiona's now heading up a project that aims to recover seagrass beds in 5 special areas of conservation around the country, and this includes a project to replant 4 hectares of it here in Plymouth Sound.
And it's very much in its trial stages at the moment because it's very challenging. It's not like on the land where you can just go and plant out a few seedlings and give them a bit of water and see what happens. Seagrass is a flowering plant and it actually does have seeds, but a tiny percentage of them actually will grow into little seedlings in the natural state. So we can collect those from the wild and then those being taken to the aquarium and then they grow the seedlings from seed and then those will be transplanted out into the bay.
But just replanting seagrass won't solve the problem on its own. Fiona's team is keen to get to the root of the other problems that are damaging seagrass in the first place.
The traditional moorings that we have, they're a big concrete block on the seabed, and then there's a chain and then the buoy, like we're bobbing around on here. And those chains that actually scours and abrade seagrass around the base of those moorings. If you go onto Google Maps, you see it in Isles of Scilly, you can see the circles around the boats where the seagrass has been scoured. There's several alternatives. The one that we're moored up to here is a Stirling mooring, and it's quite a simple system, but basically there's just a number of buoys on that chain that lifts that chain off the seabed. And they have seen that in these areas the seagrass is growing back up to the base of the mooring.
But a big part of the problem is that many sailors just don't know what's beneath them.
And I came out here last May bank holiday, came to talk to some of the people anchoring, let them know that actually there's a seagrass bed below there, it's a sensitive habitat, it's protected. A lot of them said, oh, really sorry, we didn't know it was there. And I'd like to think once people do know where there is, they'd like to take action to avoid anchoring within seagrass beds.
Another serious threat to seagrass is runoff of topsoil and slurry from farmland, which will happen more often as winter rains become more intense.
Seagrass needs light to grow. If you get a mass deluge of red, muddy water coming down into the sea, then that's going to increase the sediment, which can have a smothering effect. You know, they're quite resilient marine species, but if we just keep piling on the stress in all different areas, they're going to struggle, and we need to give them some help because they are so important.
And ironically, our efforts to fight climate change could actually create another source of stress for marine habitats. The government wants all our homes to be powered by offshore wind by 2030, and this is going to mean huge amounts of underwater construction, pipelines and cables. But these things are usually encased in concrete to protect them, and concrete production itself actually releases huge amounts of carbon. Now one local company has come up with an ingenious low-impact alternative involving this pile of Cornish china clay waste and what looks like a heap of old washing machines.
As divers, we'd seen the damage done to rocky reef habitats and limestone habitats through bottom trawling. We all come across these trawl marks and absolute devastation in the seabed. And unfortunately, rock doesn't regrow. So we thought, well, let's come up with a way to recreate these rocky reef habitats and to provide sustainable homes for marine life. So they're made from a Portland-free concrete mix with recycled materials. It's 80% less carbon to produce our cubes. We need artificial reefs because there's a massive decline in our commercial fish stocks and marine species in a whole worldwide. Primarily that's because of man's interaction with the ocean, and whether it's building offshore wind farms, oil and gas platforms, or trawling for shellfish, we've caused a lot of damage, and we need to act now to put something back and give the species somewhere they can grow up. They look very grey initially. Once they're deployed, after about 3 months, you'll have a very thick biofilm already adhering and covering the cubes, so a green browny colour, and that is the start of the reef build. And from that, you'll get barnacles, you'll get tube worms, you'll get kelps, we'll get seaweeds, and we'll all adhere and start growing from the cubes.
James hopes they could also be used to help restore fragile habitats around the world that are already being affected by climate change. The company's trying to propagate coral onto the cubes and also trying to grow mangrove seedlings in them, which could help to build up coastal defences in low-lying tropical countries. But as sea levels rise and storms increase, they could help Cornwall too.
Cornwall's got a very, very long coastline with lots of open areas to the sea and coastal erosion. And if we can protect the coastline from the damage and from the storms and provide marine habitat for organisms, then it's a win-win. Our current production is probably 200 to 250 different size cubes per day, but we're hoping to upscale our manufacturing on a much larger scale with batching plants and other machinery. We could be producing maybe 2,000 to 3,000 cubes a day, and we need to do that to actually have an impact. Ultimate goal for 20 years' time, I'd like to see reef cubes, or if not reef cubes, nature-inclusive design used for all offshore construction. We've got the technology, we've got the know-how, and we shouldn't be building stuff in the sea if it's not going to benefit the sea life as well.
I've been lucky enough to meet some of Cornwall's top marine experts while I've been making this film, and the message from all of them has been clear. Climate change is going to bring huge challenges, but there will be opportunities too. And in fact, with so much sea surrounding us, Cornwall could really pave the way in protecting the marine ecosystems that are going to be critical to protecting us in future. It's still not too late as long as we all get on board now and do our part to protect the sea, because it controls our climate and supports such a vast array of life, and that life includes us.
Do we have any questions to ask about after that film?
I am under the impression that climate change anxiety is becoming a bigger problem, and young people especially, I think we're really worried about climate change, even though there's also things to make it better. But what would you say your advice would be to someone who is experiencing climate anxiety?
Yeah, I completely agree. I've got two teenage kids, 15 and 17, and obviously they get a lot of this from me at home, but and I quiz them on what kind of information they're getting from school about climate change, and I've just been so horrified, really. I mean, I don't know what your experience has been the same, but they learn about it in science, but it's very abstract. You know, it's a water cycle and atmospheric chemistry, and then if you choose to do geography, not everyone does geography, for GCSE, you know, you will get those sorts of overseas case studies and things. But I just feel like we're all sticking our heads in the sand. This is something that's going to, I mean, it's going to affect us, but your generation and younger, you know, it's going to really have a massive, massive impact. And there's a campaign group which is quite interesting, I don't know if you've heard of, called Teach the Future. They've done surveys with students and school students and teachers, and they found 4% of students said that they felt they knew a lot about climate change. 75% of teachers said they didn't feel equipped to teach about it. And I think part of that is, you know, the curriculum is very, very busy and there's not much room for anything outside of that. But also I think it is that fear of unleashing eco-anxiety, and then what do you do with that? How do you address it? Because you can't say, oh, don't worry, it's going to be all right, because we don't know, you know, it's not really heading in a very good direction at the moment, so it's really hard. So what would I say? I think, personally, I think that it's, we all have some degree of anxiety. You know, I think even people that are denying it are doing it because the alternative is the anxiety. But I think it might feel easy to give up and do nothing, but if you do nothing, then definitely there is no hope. So I think, you know, we all have to embrace active hope, and active hope means doing something, even if it ultimately isn't going to help. You know, at least you feel, this is what I'm trying to do with these films. You know, I don't know whether it can make that much difference, but within the range of skills that I've got, this is what I can contribute. And we're doing a lot of going out to community groups and into schools and trying to talk to young actually introduced on some level across the curriculum, but also very much sort of talking to young people about what they can do and how they can become part of the solution and what those jobs are. You know, there's a whole new economy of different jobs that are coming that, you know, they're not being talked about. And you know, what you can go into with the courses and disciplines that you're studying. Many of these things are really exciting, you know, and obviously, you know, where we live, there are so many opportunities. So I think it's sort of trying to harness that positivity. But yes. And I think also, because while you're not getting education about it very much at school, you're getting extremely out of social media. And, you know, I think combined with the impact of isolation during COVID and everything else, it's just a sort of really toxic mix. Not very helpful ones.
Mitigation strategy for global change.
Mitigation. That's a really big question. I think the problem with climate change is that people think, well, it's going to be about sea level rise. You know, that's the big problem for global, and you know, that's going to make storms much more violent. And certainly, I've experienced that myself. I used to live right on the seafront, and in 2014. We had those terrible storms and our house was completely smashed open and we were homeless for 6 weeks. I'd lived there all my life and I've seen storms that were nothing like that. That storm was so small, it didn't even have a name. But because it occurred just in a sort of perfect confluence of things, so it was the highest tide of the year, spring tide obviously, the right wind direction, and it happened at high tide. And because we've already had 20 centimetres of sea level rise, that meant the force of that water hitting was just that much more than it would have been before. You know, and that is the difference that we're going to see with storm surges and storms as we go forward. But people think about things like that in isolation. Oh, you know, we need to build more walls, or we need to not build walls. You know, but it's not just about sea level rise. You know, it's about everything. About our food security, you know, this is a massive one, I think, because in the UK we import more than half of all the food that we eat. We're very vulnerable. We're already at the end of very long supply chains. Cornwall's right down the end of those supply chains. We can see now what's happening with the wheat situation in Ukraine. You know, possibly what might be happening in the future when crops collapse in places that we import from. So I think there's a huge need. Very much to look at more local food security. At the moment, about 80% of our land in Cornwall, or of our farmland in Cornwall, is either growing cows or food for cows. Yeah. Yeah. You know, we could be growing so much more. And then there are opportunities. You know, we were interviewing last week the guy from the University of Exeter who was doing lots of work in microclimate mapping. Looking at actually places that could be really suitable for growing all sorts of things we haven't thought about. We only think about growing potatoes and cauliflowers and maize for cows and you know, daffodils. We're the #1 daffodil grower in the world. But you know, actually, we could be growing sunflowers and soya and sweet potatoes and all sorts of other things. You know, so I think it's thinking about things as a system. It's not just this problem. You know. There's food security, there's the impact on health, and as we've seen just recently with the heat wave, you know, we've got a very ageing population in Cornwall, people living in very remote locations, the transport is absolutely appalling. You know. So it's a real wicked problem because there's so many things to look at all at once, but I think really one of the most important things to look at is our food system.
I want to know your thoughts on all these big scale companies that basically greenwash and guilt us into being conscious of our impact on the planet and they themselves are the companies. Because I know it always gets pushed to us like through social media, through TV, like, oh, make sure you do all this. Yeah, and usually I do like agree that we do need to try, but it doesn't mean we need to be perfect around it. But it just says the same fact.
No, I completely agree. I'm sure you probably know, but do you know who developed the first carbon calculator that calculate your individual PP. I mean, it's very similar, I think, to the tactics that we use by the tobacco industry, by the plastics industry, and everything else. I mean, I've heard presentations by the chief executive of the British Plastics Federation. It's absolutely terrible, all this plastic washing up. Nobody wants that, and we're absolutely appalled by it. But it's down to irresponsible consumers. It's not to do with us. It is appalling, and I think it's really unhelpful as well, because it increases anxiety, and you have people who I know many, who just like scratching around trying to do absolutely everything they can, and making their own clothes and growing all their own veg and going over on a bicycle, and it's not going to make any difference, even if all of us as individuals in the country, I'm not saying it's not going to make a difference, but we could all be doing as much as we possibly could, and actually that's still not enough, because it's those big changes that are needed, and I do worry with what's happening in politics at the moment. Not that I was a huge Boris fan, but at least he, or maybe it was Carrie, I don't know, was pushing some sort of environmental agenda, and then you just look at the people that we've got going up to be our next PM, and it's just sort of like worrying. So it does make me very angry, and I think it's really counterproductive. In fact, just yesterday or the day before, I heard something. It was what's her name, Kim Kardashian, promoting some plant-based food, and in that really nauseating California accent, going on, that's better for the planet, and then there was a thing in the paper yesterday, my sister doing a day to 2 17-minute flights, to go things up in their private jet. It's just this real kind of dissonance, isn't it? I hope you didn't think I was coming to give you any answers, because I don't. But I think, we have to really, and it's very difficult in our political system as well, and particularly in Cornwall, where it's very entrenched sort of Tory heartland, and we've got a 6-Tory MP. I'm not saying that all Tories are terrible, but they're not necessarily the most environmentally progressive party. And it's difficult, really. We have a lot of apathy in our political system, don't we? Because you could be 49.9% of people who didn't get your candidate in, and your whole voice is just annihilated. But I think we do have to make our voices heard. We have to be politically active. We have to vote. We have to write to our MPs, and we have to let them know what we think, because it's so easy to just miss the point. I just keep getting those stupid 2-line letters back again. But if you let your voice be snuffed out, then it's nothing. Sign the petitions, go on the demos. The media's done a pretty good job of demolishing Extinction Rebellion. Very much turn the public opinion against it, but just got to keep going. That was very awful. I think you never write one. But just again, I just don't know what the alternative is. I mean, it's very easy to give up. I often think about, I'm sure you've all heard this, but I think we just live in such an individualistic society now, don't we? And I think it's quite hard. I even know older people, who just said to me, oh, well, that's what my grandchildren sort out, I'm dead soon, I don't care. And I just think, how can you not project beyond the end of your own lifetime, care about the generations to come? And there are other cultures in the world that have a completely different approach. Lots of Native American cultures, no decision is made without thinking about the impact that that's going to have on the 7th generation from now. And I think, I don't know how we would go from this world view to that one, but I think if we were able to act in that way, what a different world we'd have.
Yes.
And all the things you've mentioned, what do you think would be the easiest one to pick and have the most major impact in the shortest possible time?
As an individual?
No, as a community, or as a county, or as a nation.
There's just so many things that need to be done at once. But I do think there's one thing that I'm increasingly starting to think is really important. Do you have pensions? So I read recently that, although actually I was listening to, do you know that Radio 4 series called Crossing the Earth? And a really good episode recently, I don't know whether you've heard of it, but they were saying, if you change what you do with your money, you might not have a huge pension, but actually everybody's pensions across the country, if you add that all up cumulatively, we are, through pensions, funding either deforestation and fossil fuels, or we could be moving that money and putting it into things that we need, solutions to climate change. And by moving your money, they estimate that has over 20 times more impact than anything else, like giving up flying or giving up meat or anything else, because you are just cutting off the financial support to, of course, so many pension funds are invested in those horrible toxic things. So I think that's really important. And there's actually, and it seems like an overwhelming list, I've got to change my pension, but actually it's on our website, I can't remember the exact name now, but there's a website, I think it's called Make My Money Matter, probably .co.uk, and it actually kind of just takes you through the whole process quickly. So I think, if everybody did really care about where they were putting their money, that would have a huge impact. As a county, I don't know, I just think there's lots of things that need to happen all at once. But again, I think a lot of it comes back down to food. I'm not advocating that everybody should become vegan, but I do think we need to massively cut down on the amount of animal agriculture that we have. It's absolutely huge. I was actually sent figures today about how much slurry is produced in Cornwall every year. It's huge. I can't quite remember. It's well over 5 million tonnes of slurry every year coming from our cattle. And of course, we're not farming cattle in the way that we were 50, 60, 70 years ago. We have farms in Cornwall where you have over 1,000 cows that never go outdoors. And all of their waste is going into these huge slurry pits, and it's sitting there, and it's emitting methane, it's emitting nitrous oxide, which nobody talks about or knows about. Nitrous oxide is 298 times more potent in terms of its greenhouse warming potential than carbon dioxide is. 80% of all our nitrous oxide in the UK comes from agriculture. But it doesn't last in the atmosphere all that long. So if we could drastically reduce that, we would immediately have a huge impact on climate change, because these gases are so much more potent than carbon dioxide is. We're feeding, because it's just this horrible tangle, isn't it? Because of these sort of terrible supermarket contracts and the fact that the farmers have been paid so little for milk. Lots and lots of dairy farmers have gone out of business, but the ones that have remained have got bigger and bigger herds and more machinery and more robotics, to try and get that little bit of profits out of the milk, which, largely they're existing on subsidies. But to make those cows more productive, they're not eating. The cows themselves have been genetically, modified through breeding to be more productive, and also they're not eating what they used to eat. So they're being fed huge amounts of maize, which obviously is a big problem because it causes a lot of soil erosion. They're eating silage, increasing their eating lots of soya coming from the Amazon, and these, soya is a bean. Beans have certain effects on even human beings' digestive systems, and very much so on cows, and this is causing them to produce much more methane emissions. It's just nuts. Where most of the milk that is produced in Cornwall is going to Davidstow, which is a huge creamery. It's the biggest creamery in the country, on Bodmin Moor. we've got a record £1.5 million fine from the Environment Agency for massive pollution of the local river in fish. And the whey in that factory is going to China to make infant formula. So it's not doing anything for local food security at all, and meanwhile it's just causing this massive problem. So, I mean, it is terrible because it's not the farmer's fault. We've all kind of sleptwalked into this situation where it's as convenient and the cheapest of the supermarkets, but somehow we've got to sort of break out that stranglehold. So I think if people can eat better milk, eat better meat as well, try and eat as much local food as you can, get some veg crops from your local food producer, just trying to minimise those food miles, minimise the packaging. I mean, all of it is important. But I suppose it's really just sort of trying to bring your footprint down, you look at the ingredients on a packet of processed food, and it's probably going to, might have cocoa from Africa, palm from Indonesia, and soya from South America. We've got the world in a packet, we didn't eat like that a few decades ago.
I'm just wondering if the current situation at the moment with increases in overall cost of living through a variety of reasons why that's now happening, is that the sort of actions that are related to climate change, people are tending to say, well, what's more important is getting food on my family's plates. And whilst I'm all supportive of I do my bit for recycling or whatever, the bigger picture I just can't cope with at the moment because I've just got to concentrate on surviving the next few months. And I think, I would imagine a lot of families feel like that in the UK.
Yeah, I'm sure you're fine. I mean, of course they do.
Yes.
We all do up to the point, it's not the easiest of times, and I think unfortunately the problem with us as a species is we are quite good at dealing with crises. There are crises and they're happening right now, like cost of living, COVID, it's there, it's happening, oh my God, we have to react. And it's like climate change is just this thing rolling along in the background, isn't it? That it's not an immediate emergency, we don't think. The problem, of course, with this one is if we don't act on it now, by the time it is an immediate emergency around that phase, it's way too late to do anything about it. And interesting that you mentioned recycling. Again, I think it's a little bit like the marine plastic thing, the fact that people love beach cleaning. People love recycling. Every time I talk to anybody about climate change, people say, oh yes, I'm a happy recycler, I always recycle. It's just like, recycling is just the tiniest waste. It's just such a small part of the picture. And recycling is not the thing that we should be looking at all. We should be refusing that plastic and reducing it and reusing it. And recycling should be the very last thing that we do, other than chucking it away. And interesting in Cornwall, I don't know how your waste is dealt with in Devon, but we've got a huge incinerator in Cornwall now, so we have no landfill anymore. All our waste is taken to this incinerator in a place called St Dennis, which is in the poorest part of Cornwall, sort of China clay country, so it's got a big China clay factory there. The whole town was already covered in a fine layer of dust from the China clay works, so probably seen quite good to put an incinerator there. It's an absolutely monstrous waste, which I believe in some ways actually classed as recycling because it's used burning the waste to create energy, so it's not just chucking it away. And ever since that incinerator came along, our recycling rates have fallen. And you sort of wonder why that is, but of course this thing is like this sort of insatiable monster. It has to burn at nearly 1,000 degrees, 24 hours a day to burn the waste. And one of the best things that you can put in is plastic, because it's got that really high energy content. you know, especially with the cost of living crisis that you're talking about, I think people think that a more environmentally positive solution is going to be more expensive, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, certainly if you want to buy as much. You know, if you get it does take a bit of organisation, but if you get a vegetable box, you know, you're probably not going to be spending any more than if you go and buy a load of stuff in plastic from the supermarket and get that because it's best for, you know, buy one get one free and then end up wasting it. You know? But it's changing thought patterns a little bit.
Do we have any other questions?
I don't know if you'd read that paper, or it's many years ago I think now, but there was an associated economic study on people who identify as more green have the worst carbon footprint of everybody.
Really?
Because we tend to be fairly well off, tend to like going on long haul flights to see beautiful places. So I think also there's a kind of thinking that one group of society, I see it quite a lot throughout my university, people kind of blaming different classes for the climate crisis. But actually I think it's generally me that is the issue and people like me that are causing most of the problem.
Yeah, I think really one of the key parts of the problem is consumption. The richer you are, the more you consume of everything. Look at places like Costa Rica, which always makes me laugh because, you know, I've been lucky enough to live in Costa Rica a long time ago. But, you know, they're an amazing country and they do all sorts of incredible stuff and it's all based on their ecotourism industry, but that necessitates people flying down all over the world, you know, what is the sort of external carbon footprint of all of that. And if they didn't have it, would they preserve what they've got? Possibly not. Yeah, it is very easy, isn't it, to say, oh, it's them, all the rubbish they're throwing out, and all the plastic that they're buying, but actually they don't have a car and they're never going to fly anywhere. And you're absolutely right. We have to all live ourselves.
I also wonder whether the rate of change is something that's affecting us.